Welcome everyone. My name is Nick Kramer. I am staff at the Council on Rural Development. I use he, him pronouns. For anyone who may not have a visual today on me, I have recently cut short blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm wearing a soon to be sweaty blue shirt that's just a touch too big. And I'm sitting in front of a really exciting door. So glad to have you all here. This, I think, is a really pertinent and important conversation. Welcome to the panel on the future of leadership in Vermont. I think that is something to talk about at a summit on the future of Vermont for sure. I'm really excited to have our panelists with us today, with me today, I guess. All of us, a really great group of people, really grateful to all of you for being here. I'll let you all introduce yourselves in a minute. But I want to go over some quick Zoom logistics or Whova logistics, all of it before we get going. Apologies if you've already joined the opening session this morning or earlier this afternoon, or are just coming from a breakout. Some of this may be repetitive, but I just want to highlight that you should see an option that closed captioning is enabled for this meeting. So on my screen, it's because my Zoom is compressed, it's under more ... or you may see a little button that says CC, and you should have the option there to either show subtitle or hide subtitle, and toggles that status. And then I think there's also a way to say view full transcript. So if you miss something, you can go back and it sort of shows as a chat window. You can see the full, it's mostly accurate. Sometimes it struggles with thick Vermont accents, I've noticed, but I don't have one of those. So let's see. This is obviously, or not so obviously, a webinar. So it's not an interactive Zoom conversation between all of us. There are the 4, 5, if you count me, panelists here. We'll be having kind of a moderated conversation. I'm going to do my best to steer that. And then I would welcome folks to put any and all questions into the chat here, or I should say the Q&A function in Zoom. So that's at the bottom of your screen. If you scroll down, you should see a little button that says Q&A. If you click that, you can put in any questions or thoughts you may have. If you have logistical questions or trouble, I would direct you to Murray Romanelli. I think it's getting cut off her last name. I want to acknowledge her. Sorry?
I said that was it. You nailed it.
That was it? Okay, great, good. It's important. Really want to thank her for being on. These virtual things don't happen without somebody on the back end kind of steering things. So kind of the most important job, and really thankful. So please feel free to communicate anything with her through the chat, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I think that should do it. I want to just give a couple brief words of introduction to this topic, why we think it's important to talk about this, and then I'll turn to panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get right into it. So the title of this session is, I think, The Future of Leadership in Vermont, or some combination of those words. New leadership, thinking towards the future. In crafting the Vermont proposition, we talked to a lot of people over the last year about a lot of different aspects of recovery, obviously, in the tumultuous moment we're all living through. There was a lot to dive into there. Their thoughts for the future, pre-standing crises, in some people's parlance, things in Vermont that we've been wrestling with for a really long time that were made even worse or more challenging by the pandemic. And one of those things that we hear, again, none of this is our personal organizational agenda, but what we sort of exist to reflect back what we hear in community conversations. And we hear a lot about the aging demographic in the state. That's something that comes up fairly frequently. I'd be surprised if many people on this call hadn't already heard that. And I think there's often a lot of confusion, or sort of depending on who you talk to, different angles on what that means. What does it mean to have an aging problem? I mean, because it could be said that it's a huge asset, you know, in a community to have the collective wisdom of a number of older Vermonters. So I think that's a piece that sometimes is important to highlight in that conversation, that to say that Vermont has an aging demographic is not necessarily a value judgment or in itself an inherent problem, but it's a fact. I have my little cheap fact sheet here. I mean, the average age in the state is a little bit under 43 years old, which is about 5 years older than the rest of the nation. According to a 2019 report by the Tax Structure Commission, they have definitely a reason to want to look at working age folks. In 2017, it was the first year in the state where we numerically surpassed having more seniors than children. So more people in the 65 plus age bracket than 18 or below. And that's one of the highest proportions in the nation. And then the projection is that by 2029, we are likely to have 1 in 4 Vermonters over the age of 65. So if you consider the number of services and supports, and generally that's retirement age, so folks are working less and it's a shrinking of the tax base. So there are some financial question marks to address when you think about an aging population. And so that's all just one lens kind of underlying this conversation about new leadership, right? Specifically thinking about maybe the next generation of leaders, or the next, and by leaders, we don't mean necessarily municipal, state, kind of officially recognized governmental leaders. There's a lot of definitions of leadership, and that's something I hope to get into today. But just thinking about who are the folks holding the reins for Vermont in the coming decades. And I think that's a pretty important thing to get into. So that's one lens. I think it's would be really odd not to mention sort of our national moment of increased awareness and kind of collective national conversation around racial disparities over the last year, and the structures, the various levels of the way we organize our society, and how racial identity is sort of intricately woven in a number of different ways all throughout that framework. And I think that that's a really also a pertinent lens to any conversation about the future of leadership and sort of Vermont identity, and what does it mean to be a Vermonter, and what does it mean to be a Vermont leader. So those are all things I'm hoping to get into today, and really grateful to have everyone here. So that's about as much of my own voice as I want to listen to for now. So I'm going to go around and, just to avoid confusion, call on folks. But I'd ask you just to briefly introduce yourself and any affiliation that you'd like to share, and a little bit, just a quick snippet, because we'll be diving in much more depth of sort of what brings you to this topic, or why you said yes when I responded to the email, or when I sent you an email asking to be part of the panel. So you are first up, Al, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Al Johnson Kurtz. I use my name or they them pronouns are just fine, and I'm based in Montpelier, Vermont. I follow Nick in kind of introducing what I look like too, in case there are folks for whom that's helpful. I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf, and I have light skin and light brown hair, blue eyes, and I am 27 years old. So I currently serve as the communications director for Change the Story Vermont, which is a gender equity initiative, a partnership of the Vermont Commission on Women, the Vermont Women's Fund, and Vermont Works for Women. I'm also a co-founder and one of the leaders of the Vermont Freedom Fund, which it was developed in partnership with Migrant Justice to support and pay bond for folks who have been incarcerated based on immigration-related charges. But we also are expanding more now beyond that and working with the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative to help free folks who are incarcerated, specifically women in Vermont who are not able to pay bail or bond. And I also serve on the leadership team of Central Vermont Surge, showing up for racial justice. And I'm very honored to be here today with this powerhouse group and accepted the invitation because I grew up in Vermont. Vermont is my home. I plan to live here for the rest of my life. And I want to make sure that we make this place as welcoming, inclusive, holistic, healthy as we can, and committed to being a part of that.
Thanks, Al. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Emily Eckert. I was adopted from India, and so that helps with the visual long black hair, and have a very light gray room with a window behind me and a closet door behind me. I've been an environmental advocate since I can remember. I grew up on the East Coast, and my mother's side of the family is from the Czech Republic. So I grew up in Connecticut. Part of my family is from the Czech Republic. The other part of my family is in Michigan. And currently I work at Green Mountain Power on the energy transformation team, which is fantastic to have a role where, you know, my passion for the environment is something that I talk about every day, and helping businesses and customers decrease their carbon impact, you know, to get off of fossil fuels and look into cleaner energy and energy efficiency. And when Nick asked me to be on this panel, for me, before I lived in Vermont, I lived in Utah when I left Connecticut first time around. Both states don't have a lot of diversity. I will say that Utah was a little harder to live in some ways than Vermont. Vermont was, for me personally, has been a great state for now, but I didn't grow up here. I do love Vermont. I do want to be here for a long time, and I do want to make an impact because I think that Vermont has a unique culture when it comes to states in general, and has a huge opportunity in leading the way and setting the example for other states as well.
Thanks, Emily. Witchy, you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, my name is Witchy Artu. My pronouns are he, him, his, they, them, theirs. I am in a room where I am getting direct sunlight. So I look whiter than I actually am, but I am a light brown skin, black hair, mustache and beard with black eyes, in a room full of books on one side and arts and crafts on the other, including a teddy bear. And I was raised between Boston and Puerto Rico. I went back and forth a lot. English is my second language. And I'm here because, well, actually, let me first say the different hats that I wear. So at the local level, I work at the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital as their data engineer. I am also a farmer and community builder at Magnetic Fields Farm in Athens, Vermont, where we aim to attract and sustain queer and BIPOC farming community. I'm also the second vice president at the Windham County NAACP, the coordinator for the BIPOC caucus at the Root Social Justice Center, and a community representative at the Vermont's Racial Equity Task Force. Since I was 14, I've done a lot of public health and social equity through community building. And a lot of the reasons why I've been able to be in the different spaces, have the skills that I have the resources that I have, is because I've had other people empower me. So I look to be in these kinds of opportunities where I can talk about and think about ways, how do we empower others? How do we create pathways and pipelines? So it's not just us in the room, but we're bringing along a whole set of people and from different generations and from different backgrounds.
Thanks, Witchy. I think that leaves you, Becca. Last but not least.
Thank you. Hard to follow up on all of those great introductions. Thanks for having me. I'm Becca White, and for description, blonde, blue eyes, white. I'm in a lavender room, and I have a giant whiteboard of Vermont behind me, which you can covet. It is amazing. A little bit about me. Oh, I use she, her pronouns. I work at Efficiency Vermont as a community engagement manager. I'm the coordinator of the Button Up Vermont campaign. So if you know anything about that, that's my bailiwick. And I also serve as a state representative for Hartford, Vermont, the Windsor 4-2 district in the legislature. A little bit about me beyond that. I grew up in the village of Wilder. I now live in the village of White River Junction. Both of those are within the town of Hartford. So for visual, the little heart pointing to my hometown. Couldn't help myself. I grew up in a low-income family. We were extremely fortunate to be able to take care of our family through social safety net programs. And my leadership style, the reason I got into municipal government in the first place when I was 20, running for select board, was because I didn't see a young woman on the board, and I didn't see someone who had my life experiences on the board. It's the same reason why I got involved in state politics a few years later. And the final thing I'll say is I'm 26, and there are a lot of Vermonters who assume when you're 26 that you're an emerging leader, and that's what I love about this panel. But I do want to highlight one thing when we use the term emerging. Everyone in this room has already described, it sounds like a decade worth of experience. So I just wanted to lift that up because Senator Rahm in the last panel said that she had been 13 years. She was the youngest serving in history senator, and she had 13 years of experience in actual elected office. So while we may call ourselves emerging, I think we've got a little bit of experience too. So thank you, Nick, for inviting me to be a part of this today. And the reason I'm joining is because I owe you a favor. So.
And now the tables have turned. So yeah, that was, and also thank you for, you basically stole my segue there. I was gonna say, I mean, I think that this issue, this word new, kind of like Bill Clinton with what do you mean by is or something like it's this word new can mean a lot of different things and have a lot of different context to it. So I think, yeah, it's really important to kick off this conversation about new leadership and acknowledge that, like I tried to say a bit and sort of building off what Richie was saying, leadership can mean a lot of things, right? And you don't, I think often the definitions of leadership that we subscribe to as a society are fairly experience centric, and that makes sense, right? There's a value to having done something and bringing that experience and that perspective to things. And there's also sometimes where there are qualities of leadership that don't necessarily have to do with experience or practice. I mean, I think one only has to look to kind of the climate issue globally to see a lot of examples of people who have stepped forward very much in the earlier part of their lives. And sometimes leadership is bravery and courage and innovation and inexperience and the ability to think beyond, prevailing models. This is a topic, if you can't tell, I would go on for a long time. But that's not my job here today at all. So I'd like to turn it over to panelists, and I guess I'll say ask for somebody to get us started. But since you are all clearly already in many ways, shapes and forms, established leaders doing really interesting things, I'd be really curious what you think it means to be a leader. And maybe specifically in the Vermont context, but not necessarily, just in general, what makes a good leader, and who is a leader? So is there anybody who'd like to kick us off there? Emily, I see, yeah, you unmuted.
Sure, I can. But I'm willing to borrow from Witchy something that you said, which was empowerment. And part of being a leader is being proactive in empowering others in your community. And to your point, where you don't have to necessarily have the experience, no one person is going to be an expert in anything, but you need to be able to leverage and harness the knowledge that's around you from all people and help people rise up and ask questions and not be afraid and not be kind of stuck in the shadows. So as a leader, encouraging leadership, in my opinion, by far the most important thing is how you interact with people. Because ultimately, to make change, you need people. You need more than just yourself. And so as a leader, your job is to bring people on board and help them excel, help them find their voice and not be afraid of using that voice, and pull out of them what are those perspectives, different views on things that they have, and what are their innovations, and how can they communicate those in a way where this is not, anything about the future is not supposed to be an argument. It's how do we come together? And so how do you correctly have those conversations? I know people in my world that get very defensive when you start having any controversial conversation, and they ultimately believe it's an argument, but you're not going to win anybody over by arguing. You have to have, I have one friend that we have very different views on something, but we can actually talk about it in a constructive way, and more of like, let's just learn, let's learn where we are both coming from, because there's validity to both views or beliefs or how they were raised. So how do we break down some of those barriers in a calm and peaceful way?
I would add to that, Emily, I think one of the pieces that you're getting at is that there's, at the core of leadership is an organizing ethos, and organizing comes in so many different forms, but it's about human connection. And so leadership, the currency of it is what is your ability to connect with other people and build community.
Wow, fabulous answers. My only additional thing that I would add is that for me, when I think about leadership in the Vermont context, a lot of it has to do with just showing up. And that has been something I have always felt we don't talk enough about, is both the ability to show up, what that actually means to show up and be present at any kind of meeting, whether it be municipal government or state level, or being able to take the time to understand an issue enough to show up and be present and be there. So to be a leader, I think you're both being able to be present, be in the meeting, and that has a lot of privilege associated with it. But it also means giving that same access wherever you can to others. So to your point, Emily, what I really appreciated that I've experienced in my life is the best leaders that I've worked with are ones who aren't kind of up center stage saying, hey, look at me, look at this great idea I came up with. It's people who are actually behind pushing forward those who actually did maybe some of the work, or are the movers and shakers who we don't necessarily spotlight as often. So yeah, that would be my definition.
Witchy, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I mean, that was all amazing. Can we just, I do have some things to add. I don't want to, yeah, I think a lot of what is being said here is like a good leader is a good follower. And understanding sort of like how you can help progress happen with a natural, with just being able to uplift everyone else and have that go towards. I think something that's sort of the darker side of leadership that I think maybe people are sometimes afraid to mention is that being a leader is recognizing that you're not always right and that you can't be in every room. So you need to always prioritize what it is that you do, and also recognize that the vision that you have for this thing is not necessarily like the best vision or the only vision. So just making sure that when you are collectively organizing, that you are, and as you empower people, that you help create the change people want to see and not help create the change that you think should happen.
Wow, glad. I wish the four of you would co-author a book. This is great. Let's see where else we go. So I guess then as sort of a follow-up to that question, I'd be really curious all of your thoughts on sort of prying into that Vermont context piece. If you're looking around 360 from all your various perspectives, where are we at now? Where does it feel like we're at in terms of our leadership in the state of Vermont? Kind of what's the current lay of the land? And then you guessed it, eventually I maybe have some questions about if there's a different place we want to go to. But just for now, kind of what do you see, positive or negative or neutral? I would just welcome, I'm sure you all have some pretty deep insights into this.
Yeah, I kind of have some opinions of where we're at now with leadership in Vermont. I think there are two sides here. I mean, I'm sure there are more than two sides. Nothing's binary, but in my perspective here, like on one side, you have like, I think Vermont's so thirsty for young people and so thirsty for young ideas and so thirsty to just like, let's do it all, let's change. And then like on the other side, you have like several things happening. One, it's like, wait, but that's like not politically feasible right now. That's one. Two, like, oh, can you do it? And like, can you do it for free? And like, let me just put out there, uncompensated labor is slavery. And like, I want to help change that idea. And three, like the privilege of like, right now I'm able to be part of this because I have the privilege to take out time off of work. Not everyone has that. People have children, people like don't have internet, people have like hourly jobs. So just knowing that we in Vermont really want leaders to come up, and at the same time, there's a lot of barriers that exist that we need to change. And if we don't change them, we're not going to see leaders come up.
I'll add, in Vermont, from my journeys of traveling around, whether it's my current job or other jobs, Vermont has a community that's deeply rooted in family and generations and generations and generations. So I work a lot with businesses, small and medium-sized businesses right now. And a lot of them are businesses that are passed down through generations. So when it comes to leadership, seeing some of the leadership of right now who built the businesses and who they're passing it along to. And so not necessarily on a community side or a political side, this perspective is more on the business side and seeing the business leadership that's evolving and the generations that are inheriting these businesses and some of that knowledge of how the business was run up until now is being passed down to the next generation. And I don't know the insight to this, but I'm curious as to what the conversations are like of the newer generation, maybe saying, hey, this is a different perspective. This is something new that we could do with the business that maybe the older generation didn't think of. Or is it one of those, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of conversations, and they just continue moving the business along as it's always been?
Emily, I really like what you just said, because I think it comes up not just in business, but I have seen that exact situation in municipal and state government. It's less of the family, although it can literally be the family passing down to the next person. But what I have experienced is, and I kind of use this story about when I ran for select board for the first time at 20, nobody asked me to run. Like there was never any like side meeting that was like, oh, you know who'd be great? That young woman who just moved back who went to UVM, she would be great. It was me like raising my hand being like, you know what, I would be great in my, hedonistic 20-year-old days. But what was happening were conversations amongst friends who already were on the board, who were 65, 75, who were going, yes, my friend so-and-so would be great at this. He's got the talent and like, we got to pull him in. So when I think about where we are as a state in Vermont, I think it's very natural for people in positions of leadership to like look like laterally and go, who do I know who is my friend or who that I admire, and not look outside of their own circles, or even kind of poke a little bit and say, who have we not heard from? And then the flip side, Witchy, I think you make a really good point, which I think there's kind of this double situation happening in Vermont where we've got young people, and then as soon as like a young person raises their hand or a person of color, we go, here is all the work. Like, here is all of the stuff that we've been meaning to do. How do you feel about doing all of that? And what I have discovered is it's just burnout. It's people get burnt, like great friends who are like super engaged. It's like 2 years and then they dip. Or I don't know, they start a family, or, you know, switch a job that doesn't give them the flexibility. Like, shout out Efficiency Vermont for letting, exactly as you put it, take the time to be a part of conversations like this. So it is that double-edged sword of when you raise your hand, there's a lot of expectations that suddenly hit you. And to be able to meet those can be extremely difficult. So I would give us like a C+, B- on leadership generally.
I would add to that, Becca, in terms of kind of like that pipeline that's being built. So the Vermont Proposition and Part 9 speaks to kind of the supports for the next generation that exists, and they list the Snelling Center, Emerge, VCRD's Community Leadership Network. Didn't mention the Bright Leadership Institute, which I think is an oversight that's a support for BIPOC Vermonters to run for office. But I do think that we are missing the kind of breadth that we need for, I'll call it a river. I'm not a fan of pipelines, as some of you may know, but call a river to leadership for young people to be able to run for office, but not just to run for office, right? Like we've talked about how leadership takes so many different forms. Where's the local organizing training for folks? You know, sure, we can get it through volunteering and through, you know, work experience, but we don't have much organizing training here happening in Vermont. All the training that I've gotten has been out of state with 350.org or the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, or other organizations that I've worked with that have provided those kind of trainings for young people. So I think there's a real gap here that could be filled by maybe some of the older generation who have some of their, you know, activism chops that you're speaking to, Nick, you know, the 65 plus folks who are retired and have some more time on their hands than we might.
Yes, definitely. There is a utilization of human resources question like lurking for sure, right? I really appreciate that, Al. I think that's a good transition into kind of what I was going to ask next, which is not to put words in anybody's mouth, but based on what the four of you said, it seems fair to say that maybe you would all advocate for some change in terms of the current landscape, that we shouldn't leave things exactly as they are, or maybe, you know, change is inevitable. Change happens. A 5-year-old turns 6, that's change. But sort of what is the change that you would like to see? You know, what, from your perspective, what directions should we head in? And I'll just resituate that in terms of kind of this conversation that we're trying to have here, that VCRD is putting on, and this whole Vermont Proposition conversation is largely about, right, this action step. So this is sort of the meat and potatoes of what we're hoping to get to. And this is all teeing up for both today and tomorrow is really the day of the session that is, we're hoping to dive into, okay, piece 1 through 9, like how do we actually do this, right? We're exploring and then trying to not just talk. So on that note, I will stop talking and I'd love to hear, yeah, what change do we need? And we'll start there. Or what needs to change, maybe.
I will go off of what Becca said earlier and say that part of the change is there needs to be a proactive outreach approach coming from the current leaders throughout the state. And proactive in the sense of of reaching out to pools of people that they don't normally. So again, Becca, I really like that analogy of people normally think of the people that they know. So if we know that that's happening, if we know that there's a bias towards the specific people that you hang out with, to intentionally reach out to the people outside of that bias or outside of that familiarity zone of the people who are in your circle, so to speak.
Yeah, and Emily, I just want to add for folks who are listening here, you know, some of the fieriest, most whip smart people I've ever met have been coworkers in the service industry when I worked in restaurants for years, right? Like, we don't just look for the young people who are already in leadership at their schools, who are kind of, you know, shaking down the doors of their school administrations. For sure, look there, but also we're missing a whole groups of people who are kind of stuck in the spiral of low wage work, but who have so much to contribute in terms of where Vermont should go, because those of us who have been there, those of us who are still there, are like feeling the effects of a capitalist system that values profit over people. And so to fix that, we need to be speaking to and elevating folks who are in those impacts right now.
I love how quickly we got to capitalism. That's exactly, that might be a generational thing, but is completely true. And just to build off of that, something that's always surprised me about Vermont is just how ready we are to accept change when it comes from the right voice, when it comes from somebody that we like have admiration for. In the same case, it could be bad ideas. It really, the person speaking, I think there's this expectation that if you are the right person to say it, that it actually is, the content of what you're saying doesn't necessarily matter. And that really worries me on the local level, because it means that we get the same exact process and the same exact type of thinking over and over again, because the same people are given increasing responsibility and increasing roles without necessarily providing any nuance. That's kind of all I got to say. Just to paying people, that's the number one thing. And not just requiring that you pay someone, but especially on the town government level, paying them in a way that makes it so that it covers the cost of doing the work. And it's extremely hard, especially just like in a real world situation. Our select board in Hartford votes on their own salary. So it's a very nice political point to make, oh, I don't think we need a raise. And you'll never guess who always makes that point. But the folks who go, actually, you know, it'd be super great, like more than $50 per meeting, because it costs me $150 for babysitting for this 5-hour meeting. And it's really hard to make that point. So in fact, the person who needs to be making the point is the person who doesn't need the raise. It can't come from the person, back to that point around like the person speaking having the most value placed on them rather than the content of their ideas. And then the only other thing I think that needs to drastically change is the expectation of how the state and local government kind of feeds up to itself. Because what I've experienced in the state legislature is it's actually not as common for young people to do like the classic planning commission, select board track to state government or to like an upper level of management. It's not actually a very traditional path that they tend to take. Usually it's like, you know, like the Representative Hashim from former state legislator who came from a state trooper background. He hadn't served in a municipal capacity beforehand, but to value that state trooper experience, to value his lived experience, and to vote him in, that's really important. So the other change we need to make is valuing different tracks to show, instead of traditional just step-by-step like select board to state tracks that we have for the last 100+ years.
I want to hold on really, like, I just want to elevate something specific that you said, Becca, that I see something that definitely needs to change. And it's the accountability structure for change. Very often I see, like, hey, we want to change this thing. Let's commission a committee. The committee writes the report. Thank you. We actually can't do all those recommendations. We're only going to like nitpick one or two. So it's like all of a sudden, oh, it's like the people who need the power structures that need to change are the power structures deciding what is going to change, and nothing's going to change because power will always want to keep the power. So it's like, if we want to change how we do change, then we got to change our change management protocols in this state. So that's definitely something that I wanted to sort of uplift. Another thing that I want to uplift of what needs to change is like, there was a big conversation last year and it kind of dropped off, and that is women of color in positions of power their families have been threatened, and they were forced out because they were scared for their families. And this is a thing that's happened years ago. That's a thing that happened several years ago. That's a thing that happened last year. And let me tell you what is going to happen again, because we don't have a mechanism to support our women of color in these seats when people go and start threatening their families because of insert reason here. And the power structures that need to change for that to happen, they're not changing. They're like, sorry, this is the law. I can't do anything about it, right? It's just like, okay, well, great. We're just stuck in the same square. So I just want to sort of make sure that that keeps being part of the conversation. How do we support, especially women of color who have disproportionately been forced out of positions of power?
Thanks, Uchi. Yeah, Emily, I'm not sure, did you get a chance to weigh in on this? You did? Okay, great. Just want to make sure. Yeah, I want to dive more into that, because I think that's specifically the accountability piece that you sort of are opening with. I'm seeing some Q&A popping up, and we're kind of at that point where we could start getting into some of these. I think there's some similar sentiments in a number of these questions. One person is saying, love the leadership philosophy described here. Curious to know if the panelists think it's important to educate the older leadership class. And if so, can you cite an example of where you feel like you've done so successfully? So I'll let that question stand for itself. I think that's a good question, but I want to situate it too in a little bit of something you were bringing up, which you have like, who bears responsibility for change, right? And we're talking about this change, and we're kind of acknowledging that there are a lot of different directions of education, right? Here's one proposed. There's a lot of different ways of communication. There's a lot of different levers to pull to enact change. And I'm curious, each of you, what you think in terms of, and there may not be a simple answer, right? Maybe it's a really complicated thing, but kind of where do we start, and who starts with what, and where should we, who is changing whom, and like, what is the I can't paraphrase what you said, which is that great bumper sticker of we need to change the change infrastructure. But yeah, who initiates this process, and then specifically this question about sort of educating the older leadership class. Love to hear your thoughts.
I can jump in on that. When I first came on with Change the Story in 2019, that was a big piece of why I took the job. Working with organizations that are part of the feminist movement in Vermont was to bring in a stronger anti-racism component to that work and to make that work more intersectional. And so one of the things that we did right off the bat was commit to a large chunk of change to support a year-long process around uprooting white supremacy within the feminist movement in Vermont. And I think that more organizations should commit to these kind of facilitated long-term processes that have the intention of transforming our organizations and initiatives from the inside out. And so that's one thing that comes up when I think about educating the older generation. It's for all of us. It's not just for the older generation, but transforming ourselves and really putting some money behind that to support Vermont-based folks who can help with that transformation.
I also want to say, I want to say two things. I think first, just to sort of answer the questions that I'm also seeing about that age and education, and I think it's so important that we recognize the wisdom and efforts of elders, of those who literally just lay the steps for us, so then we can go and then lay the next steps. And I also think it's important to remember that as we're like, especially with like, and I'm gonna quotations, young leadership, that we're like, that when we're like, it would be great if this thing existed, or if we could do this thing, instead of like starting our own thing, like we should talk to people who have been doing this work. Like, is this a thing that we've tried? Is this like, how did it go? How can I help you? How can I go in and insert myself and insert my resources into things that are already happening? And in that way, being able to encourage that conversation that Emily was talking about, that collaboration, that being able to uplift each other, because in those moments, the people who are from older generations or younger generations are going to learn from you, and vice versa, through those conversations. And I do just want to sort of put a plug in here just to a point before Becca, and to answer like who has responsibility here. Right now, it is the power structures. And Becca, you mentioned something about childcare, about the fact that you're at select board. You're like, well, I gotta pay a babysitter, you know? The Brattleboro Select Board actually approved a reimbursement for childcare, and it's on the honor system. And I would love to see other select boards do the same. So.
That's awesome. So trying to remember, this was a two-part question. I think that one of the parts that I want to say is we need like a buddy system because we have just like Witchy said, the generation that's created the foundation. That foundation sometimes is good and sometimes it's not so good, right? So needing to pull from the older generation or the existing leaders that have created a strong foundation. On the flip side, to communicate and to help the ones that have created a not good foundation, for lack of better terms, so they can see where we're coming from or where we want that change to be. So there's the responsibility is number one on that generation that's created the foundation, but the responsibility is equally on the generation that's coming, that is the one that's looking out to the future and saying, what's our future going to look like? So the responsibility in my mind is a 50-50. It's between both that need to come together, because you're looking at, if you look at a house, you have the foundation of the house, and then you need to make sure that the structure you put on top of the foundation is resilient and will thrive in the future.
Emily, I love that you used the house analogy. Well, to answer the two-part question, I think who is accountable? I love, Emily, that you said 50-50, but I feel like it's got to be like 90-10, but the other way. So I slightly disagree. And that might be because I have been extremely lucky where I've had, in our community in particular, there's a group of folks who are just really engaged in getting people involved, and they're kind of behind the scenes, and they've kind of taken on that role. Shout out to Lynn Bohai and Ann Reynolds in my communities. Like, there are some behind the scenes powerhouse women who are very much retired, who are like doing the work. And So I feel very comfortable saying 90-10 because I know that I can do a little bit of the 10 because they're going to hold the brunt of the work. And that's not the same in every community. And then the thing that I was intrigued by the question on, what's an area of successful where you have that information sharing. And from my work at Efficiency Vermont, we have something called the Target Communities Program. And VCRD works with us on work similar to that with like the climate communities model. So it's where you go into a community and you work really closely with that community to develop a system that when you leave, they're still going to be able to maintain all of the great measures that you've introduced. From the Efficiency Vermont side, that's, heat pumps and efficiency rebates and helping folks weatherize. So what I found has worked really well is when we can go into a community and have them be a part of the decision-making process for what works for them. And then also setting it up so it's not, hey, when we leave, all of the strings are taken away, you have nothing, figure it out, but that you're actually educating them to understand how they can take advantage of the resources when you're gone. And to do that, you need lots of partnerships, whether that be, in my case, with folks like Green Mountain Power or VCRD in my work setting. But, Al, to your point with Change the Story is such a great example of an organization that does this with partnerships already. And I found that the best ways the best models for getting folks involved and building up a new base of leaders is when you have lots of cross-sectional organizations working together to try to do one common thing versus all of us doing like our own little thing in our own little world, hoping that different people show up when usually the same people who are involved in different town activities, it's like a group of 10. So we're kind of dividing their time unnecessarily. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I think that the accountability is more on the older generation and that partnerships and working to have a decision-making process with the communities affected is really how you build into the future.
Well, so for fear of approaching kind of the same question from a different angle, I'm really hearing this common thread of, well, for one thing, this issue of capacity, right? And burnout and sort of who is taking on work and who are we asking to take on work and how are we sort of, what are the expectations there? And then I'm seeing, and I'm trying my best to kind of weave in some of these questions in the Q&A. I see, Al, you've been responding to a couple. That's great. I'd encourage all panelists, if you want to do that. But CQ Strategies here is asking about what mechanisms are already in place in Vermont, and if not, what new ones might be created to increase the number of and skill building of new young leaders. And I think it's fair to point out that that's directly related to that capacity question, right? Like basic, this is me showing off my math degree, that if you have more leaders, then each one has to do less, right? More young leaders. And I also don't want to lose sort of higher up. I think it was, Glenn McRae brings up this issue. We're talking a lot about new, young, we're talking about age discrepancy, and a lot of this applies kind of beyond age boundaries. So there are a lot of people who have been traditionally disenfranchised from leadership who aren't just younger folks. And so I think that's a great point, Glenn, and want to highlight that. And maybe we can kind of bring that in as we continue the conversation. How are we, I guess the question is to build off what CQ Strategies is asking here, sort of what are the tools in place in the state already existing to develop new leadership? And if you all have other ideas for ways to lean into those, to support, to integrate with existing good leadership development, and then also ideas for new ways, maybe at the community level, to build new leaders. How are we broadening that net to bring in younger voices and also all voices, right? Everyone who is part of society should be included in leadership, I think. Bold statement.
I can jump in on that because CQ Strategies is my mama. I think that one of the things that I love about a lot of the organizing that I do is that it's intergenerational. So Change the Story, Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, and the Vermont Freedom Fund, we've got everything from folks in their, like, I think we had somebody who was like 17 on Surge at one point, all the way up to folks in their late 70s. And I think that those kind of environments where, like, it's a huge privilege to be able to volunteer, right? So I think that we do need more spaces that are paid training ground for young people. But for those of us who can spend time volunteering, it's like, that is an awesome way to get connected to some of the institutional knowledge, elder knowledge, and wisdom, and also the like youth energy, and to blend those things. So I just feel so lucky in the groups that I work with to have that full range. And I just hope that in whatever we build to support our river of leadership, that we can continue to incorporate those relationships across generations.
I want to answer this with two different things. I think, well, for like leadership mechanisms, I think I definitely agree with like paid trainings. I think that's like payment is like, we live in a world where like lives off of money, so we can't live without money. So that is like number one barrier. I do want to sort of say that I think this proposition talks a lot about ways that people are disenfranchised, that prevents them from even accessing the mechanisms that exist. Like in Brattleboro, right, or like in Windham County, I've seen like there's so many people without housing, so many people with food insecurity, so many people who are like just trying to take care of their children while like managing their jobs, while like trying to be socially healthy in a pandemic. And it's like, people who don't have mentorship opportunities, people who don't get asked to be in these spaces, people who don't have internet, who don't have self-service, like there's so many barriers for people. I almost want to change this approach from what are mechanisms that we need to instill to promote leadership to how can we remove barriers to be able to help the people just assume those positions. Because part of training is being able to just be in those spaces and being able to say, especially those with lived experiences, I would love, for example, when we're talking about housing, to include homeless people. Like, how can we just go be like, hey, come join this conversation. I would love to talk to you about how we can provide housing for those who are without housing. But that doesn't necessarily happen. So if I want to talk about a mechanism, I want to talk about that. That's sort of my feeling and opinion about it.
Yeah, and Wichi, I think you actually bring up a really good point about housing, which I think kind of underscores a lot of this conversation, which is I get a lot of flack, or I hear a lot of flack on young people who move. It's like, oh, they were only here for a few years, and then, yeah, we don't see that person anymore. And it's because the ability to have a settled place to live is actually really hard in Vermont if you don't have a very stable income or you've inherited the location. So a lot of our systems of government in particular are predicated on the fact that you are going to stay in a very specific area for a very long time, whether that be actual representative government or, your ability to attend meetings. And just to build off so I luck out and I get to chair the ad hoc committee on emergency shelter in my town, which essentially is the committee that works on housing the unhoused residents of our town out of COVID-19 was how it started. And what we were really fortunate to have was members of the unhoused population be able to attend our meetings. What we struggle with is where folks didn't have consistent ability to be at the meetings. So we really wanted to prioritize them when they could be there. So I think it's when you have someone who doesn't necessarily fit who does fit with the group of people you're trying to communicate with. It's prioritizing them in the moment. So in a real life scenario, it's you need to change your minutes a little bit. You need to change your agenda a little bit, because if someone's able to make time when their time is more precious, or their access to that is more precious, you have to prioritize them. And I think that's hard in Vermont, because we like the idea of kind of consistency and showing up all the time, and to be listened to, you need to always be there. And that's not necessarily the case when people have life circumstances that don't allow them to do that. And then the other resources that people have that they can take advantage of, they're just statewide. I know we talked a little bit about Emerge Vermont, but the benefit of organizations like Emerge Vermont and some of the other groups, like I think about the Bright Institute, is that they actually create an affinity group. It's not just the training, it's that you meet a cohort of other people who are in the same situation. So you can text, like the amount of texts I've sent that are like, holy crap, did you just hear what that person said in this meeting? Or, oh my gosh, is this normal? Like, can you explain this to me? When you have a group of people who are in the same situation, you actually are able to work effectively. And, you know, I look at colleagues like, I'll just give a shout out to Emily. One of the things I love is we were in a meeting together and I immediately was like, she's awesome. Like, I need to connect. So being able to have networks of connection that are naturally built, that aren't like trainings necessarily, but are just, here's how you meet those people, and like get their phone number, and like have an assumption that you can text them about the thing that is like your barrier, and they can say, oh my gosh, I've been there too. And especially in, I can go on a whole tangent, so apologize, but like folks in Rutland, I want to talk to you because I'm in White River Junction. Folks in Brattleboro, I want to talk to you because we have a downtown. Like, there's all these cross things that if you just have someone's contact information, or you're in an affinity group with them, it really breaks down the barrier to being able to accomplish task, because you could just communicate with them on a person-to-person level, and you don't need to worry about like sending a formal email, which can take a lot of time. So that's my rant, is networks that you can have affinity spaces with.
Okay, I have two things I jotted down. First thing is, Al, absolutely love the description of your organization of having people from the age of 17 to the age of 70. And that's what I meant by buddy system, like being able to have people through all different ages together, working together cooperatively. That's amazing. And then in the Q&A, asking what mechanisms are already in place in Vermont, if any, and what new ones might be created to increase the number of and skill building of new young leadership. I am going to encourage, so I'm also a huge fan of personal development. And I think that being a leader, that's a huge chunk of what you need to do to be a strong leader, is personal development and confidence and all of that. And so I think it would be so, so valuable to have leadership skills or a leadership type of class in school. So bringing it into schools and teaching kids from high school on about leadership, possibly even younger. But in high school, that's when people, at least for me, that's when I was starting to evolve who I am as an environmentalist, who I am as a person, as an activist, as an advocate. And so in high school, it's so important because there's so many things going on anyways in regards to kids going through the emotions of growing up and relationships and self-esteem, and that all can affect who you are as a leader. If you have certain experiences in high school within the social groups there, that will affect whether you feel that your voice is strong or is not strong. And so to have courses in high school that encourage people from a young age, hey, your voice matters and this is how you can use it. And these are the skills that actually you need to be a leader, regardless of what industry or regardless of how you facilitate your leadership. You need certain foundational skills to be a leader, and this is what they are. And let's go practice them. Not just a course that's going to be lecturing them, but let's go practice them. Pick a specific topic that you're passionate about, and let's go train you in real life or have you experience it in real life. Organize you know, or organize a protest, organize a food drive, maybe present in front of a class, but give them hands-on experience of what it takes to be a leader.
I'm muted, by the way, because it's biblically raining outside, and I think that's what bumped Al a second ago. So just a heads up, if either of us go off, that's all that's going on. So that I'm very, very pleased with this conversation and just really feel glad to be a part of this. I'm noticing, looking at the clock, we have about 10 more minutes left. I'm hoping to get to 2 more questions at least. I've got a couple here. I want to encourage folks in the chat or in the Q&A to voice any questions. We will do our best to answer by text. I'm sure panelists may be open to connection afterwards. There's an opportunity in Whova to do that directly. But I want to get to 2 things, maybe just one, but I want to talk about Vermont identity for a minute, because I think that that's a mythical beast that is a little different depending on who you talk to. But I think there are some, at least in the conversations that VCRD has been a part of, there are some common themes that emerge when we talk about Vermont identity. And I think that's a really interesting concept. And I think it's very relevant to this topic. And so I would be curious, all of your perspectives from the various experiences that you've had. Is there a single Vermont identity? Are there multiple? Is that a fictitious beast? And how does that concept, true or false, relate to this topic that we're talking about, namely leadership and the development of leadership, or the access to decision-making?
I can answer part of it. Sorry, Witchy, did you want? So I can answer part of it. The part where I have observed, and again, I'm not a native Vermonter. I was not born and raised here. I moved here 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And I moved here because I loved the fact that there weren't a lot of people here and that most of Vermont is all nature and woods. Right? So those are the things that attracted me. And so as I've traveled the state through my job at Green Mountain Power, and my previous jobs have been a lot of driving around the state and seeing that the identity is rooted, for lack of better terms, talking about woods, but rooted in kind of independence. And I don't know if seclusion's the right word, but Vermont kind of has its bubble. Vermonters love the fact that there's not a lot of people here. And I think that every perspective that's at the table, or should be at the table, are all coming from a perspective of wanting to protect what we have in Vermont. It's just some parties view what they're protecting and their belief systems on what it is that they're protecting is different than others. Some are protecting, well, I won't even go into what they're protecting, but we all want to protect something about Vermont because we have our bubble here. It's just there's probably more than 2, but kind of 2 main pathways of what exactly are we protecting in Vermont.
I think now is a really good time to talk a little bit about settler colonialism. And I recently did out all of my ancestry, and I've had, and you hear this when you go to small towns across Vermont, right? Like, how many generations has your family lived here? And with my family, it's 8 or 9 generations in this area, like Waitsfield, Cabot. It's pretty cool to see that. But what we need to release from ourselves is that settler colonial identity that sets up dominion over the land, and really like look into how is that playing out in how we're exerting leadership in our culture. And I'm trying this on. This is new for me. But I think there's a lot to be learned from the people who have lived here for millennia, the Abenaki folks who are the original inhabitants of this land, And what can we learn about culture and different ways of being that can help us heal our relationship with each other and this place?
Yeah, Al, I definitely wanted to talk about that same identity that is so everywhere in Vermont about like, oh, but are you a real Vermonter? It's like, listen, first of all, a real Vermonter, to the people who actually say they're a real Vermonter that are not Indigenous people, just means you were involved in killing and murdering them. So I just want to put that out there, first of all. Second of all, and I'm speaking, and I'm not like necessarily speaking to like conservative folks, I'm speaking to liberal folks here. Stop using the fact that you're a Vermonter to be like, I deserve this leadership position because I've been here for a long time and so has my family, therefore I know things. It's like, no, no, no. You're literally creating a cultural barrier for new leadership. And I don't want to say don't say you're a Vermonter. I'd love to call myself a Vermonter. In fact, I do call myself a Vermonter. I come from a background that was all about, in Puerto Rico, it's Vermont in summer, that's Puerto Rico. It's the same thing. So, and that's like one of the reasons why I live here, because I can't go back to my home country because capitalism and imperialism has forced like countless years of destroying my family home, literally. And so like, I can't go back there. I can't farm there. I can't, my whole entire family's left. All of my friends have left. There's nowhere that home I can go back to. So I, as a person who have decided to stay here, to live here, to build my family here, to empower others here, I'm going to call myself a Vermonter. And I am going to live in Vermont and welcome anyone else who wants to be here and empower each other and live as a Vermonter. And I think the identity of Vermont is the fact that we love collaborating, that we love empowering others, that we are also like a bunch of introverts who like to live in the woods. But yeah, I just want to say, I think for the Vermont identity, I just want to sort of, with a word of caution, just say, I think something beautiful about Vermont is that we love to come together and we love to have spaces like this, and we are thirsty for change, we are thirsty for leadership, and I think we lead the nation in a lot of things. I mean, even just look at the COVID numbers, right? We're like #1 in vaccine, in like people vaccinated. We're like the only thing to be like, okay, we're doing BIPOC clinics because BIPOC folks are, there's a disparity there. And it's a Republican governor, right? Like, this is Vermont. And I love Vermont. I love being in Vermont. So that's for me what the Vermont identity is.
Wow. Those were incredible answers. I'm like taking notes over here, like, okay, yeah. So since I have nothing to add, I'll just tell a story, which is I went to UVM and I had Professor Richard Watts, and I took a class on Vermont, like, what is Vermont? And I was like, yeah, I'm gonna get an A+ in this class. Like, I got this one. And the first day of the class, Professor Watts said, okay, everyone, I want you to draw a Vermonter. Like, what? Draw a Vermonter for me. And I might have kind of caught on as I looked around, but I drew my grandmother. I was like, oh, I'm gonna draw my grandma because like she's a real Vermonter. And I thought that was very creative. And then when we flipped over, he had us all show, I was the only person in like this 40-person class who drew a woman. Like, so, and of course everyone's white. So like there's already a basis. Everyone's white. I was one of the few people who didn't draw someone in like lumberjack clothing, like, so it just kind of blew my mind because I was like, oh, this is, when we think, like when we visualize, or at least that class visualized Vermonter, they pictured like Rusty DeWeese, and not necessarily like the diversity of people that we have in our community. And then the only other thing I'll say that to piggyback off the who is a real Vermonter and who isn't a real Vermonter, this is like the suckiest part about being a Vermonter, is how much we love to talk about being real Vermonters and how we even make people who live in Vermont think that they are not real Vermonters. And I'm talking like the Burlington stuff. We all need to get a lot better at not saying Burlington isn't Vermont. Because if we can't even accept that people who live in Burlington, Vermont don't count as living in Vermont, then we have a whole host of other issues. And I've even heard about Brattleboro, like, oh, Brattleboro is not really Vermont. Like, you know, it's so funny to me that when we have successful parts of our state, we count them out as not being authentic. And there's like this authentic hard scrabble Vermonter who's a myth. And I hope that we can get over that identity problem because it's really holding us back. So that's my only additional thing. And shout out to Professor Watts for a great like lesson in drawing.
I'm sure that's what he advertises, his professor of drawing. Well, I'm noticing we are 1 minute past our time. I want to be respectful of everybody's afternoon, but so I'll keep closing remarks super brief, just to say really thank you so much to the 4 of you. Thank you, Murray, for all the logistical help. This was a really fascinating conversation to be a part of, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here. There's lots that we didn't cover. I have more questions now than when we started, but I hope to some degree, and I don't want to speak for anyone, but like we've talked about this idea of we live in a state with small pipelines and communications, and I think generally we are all fairly open to ongoing communication. So I would at least invite any follow-up from participants. We at VCRD are happy to field contact information. If panelists feel similarly, I invite you. I think the Whova platform has like a direct networking component, so I'd encourage folks to go there too. You can send some deep private messages and stuff. And yeah, thank you for attending this second of 5 or 6 panels on these next couple days, and really grateful to everyone for forwarding the conversation. So with that, we'll end it and encourage anyone. There's an evening session tonight if you're interested, if you can't get enough on the future of Vermont. And then there's several exciting things tomorrow. Like I said, the more participatory, we're going to start to really dive into actions, think through how do we move forward some of these pieces. And tomorrow evening, we're having a storytelling event, a Moth-style storytelling event with a bunch of different Vermonters to bring their perspective on why they chose to live here. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day, and avoid the thunder and lightning.
Thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure.